All right, it is time to begin. I'm really looking forward to this. Thank you all so much for joining. I'm very excited to go over this topic with everyone today. And the topic of the day is how do we maximize how athletes are used in advertising. Through this presentation, you're going to be able to make a lot of parallels to how celebrities are used in advertising. This is a topic that is relevant across the board to the vast majority of brands and certainly agencies. And so I'm actually really profoundly interested in the results because we conducted an original study here, a never before seen done study in order to really start to dig into this question of how do we make sure that when you are paying to use an athlete in your advertisements, in your marketing, how can you really maximize that impact? And what are the key lessons that we have learned from the research that we have done? The research that I'm about to present, it's been presented only once before, and we constructed the research for the Advertising Research Foundation. And just about a week ago, we presented it to about 200 folks at a small event at the Advertising Research Foundation. The content was really well received, and I'm excited now to sort of share it even more broadly. And I was excited that they asked us to put this content and study together in the first place. So let's take a look and set the stage for what are we really talking about when it comes to athletes in the world of marketing. So when you look at an athlete's earnings, their total earnings, what I want everyone to do, and you'll do this in your mind because we're not in person to completely interact with each other, is let's take a guess. How much of each athlete's earnings, and I'm going to show you 3 examples, do you think comes from the money they make for playing their sport versus the money they make for being an endorser, to be sponsored by a brand in order to augment their income through those endorsements? So let's start with Tom Brady. So everyone in your minds think about, okay, Tom Brady, proportionally, what percent of Tom Brady's income is from playing football, and what proportion of his income is from endorsing brands? So you probably have a guess in your mind, and probably you're not too far off. Let's see, and let's see if this is anything close to what you have in your mind. So about 55% of Tom Brady's earnings come from him playing his sport, what he makes on the field. And therefore, 45% of his income comes from endorsements. So that's one good example. I said I'm going to give you 2 more. So Tom Brady, about 50-50. Certainly the endorsements are a big proportion of the income that Tom Brady earns. LeBron James. All right, get a number in your head, take a guess. What do we think? LeBron James, how much from the sport, how much from endorsements? And so the answer is 40% for playing basketball, and 60% of his money is made from endorsements from all the different various brands, including Nike and Sprite and Powerade, that the LeBron James is being sponsored to talk about and to be in advertisements for. All right, one more example, Serena Williams. Now, there's a lot of different factors that play into this, including some of the things that are popular in the news today and that we should all be really thinking about and addressing. But ultimately, Serena Williams' income, only 14% is coming from her being a tennis player, getting paid to play tennis, whereas 86% of her income is from all of the different endorsements that Serena Williams does. So first of all, I found that just incredibly interesting, and I hope that you did as well. And we know that endorsements are just huge. I mean, the amount of money that these athletes are making in the first place, and to look at even more of their income is coming from endorsements, from a wide variety of brands is a pretty big deal. And so we're asking the question here, is it worth it? Does it make sense to be paying athletes so much money for endorsements? And not only is it worth it, but assuming it is, how do you make sure to get the most bang for your buck? And that's what we're going to be covering today. So the first question, what we really wanted to dig into, is this detailed, nuanced question of what is the impact of the fit between the product and then purchase intent. What is the fit between how somebody is tied to the product that they're endorsing, if it is a good fit, that seems that it's relevant for them to be endorsing it, and how does that affect people's purchase intent, and ultimately their engagement. That's going to be a big question that we cover today. And what if the fit is lower and it doesn't seem quite natural that that athlete and that product, they just don't seem to go together? What effect does that have? So that's one of the key questions that we're going to cover today. And in order to cover it, we're going to go back in time. We're going to a study that was published in the Social, Cognitive, and Affective Neuroscience Journal in 2008, and it's an interesting study. And the way that the study worked was as follows. They showed athletes paired with either something that was a perfect fit, for example, Andre Agassi with a tennis racket, and had people in an MRI machine looking at their brain activity and asking questions about things like purchase intent and understanding what is the effect of when Andre Agassi is endorsing something that he is a perfect fit for, anything tennis related. What happens? What do we learn from that? And then comparatively speaking, what do we learn when you take the same athletes, and in this study there was a whole broad array of different athletes, different pairings, high fit, low fit, but let's say Andre Agassi is endorsing a soda or a beer. Does that have a differing effect? And you're starting to generate some hypotheses in your minds right now, and that's great. That's exactly what I want you to be doing. And let's see if those hypotheses come true. So what did we learn from this research? And then what we're going to do is we're going to show some of our original, more recent research to see, do we find consistent results? And if not, where are things different and why are they different? So there are a few really critical things. First of all, one of the elements is that people were asked in a survey, does an athlete endorsing a product affect whether or not you are likely to be more akin to remember or purchase that product? And lo and behold, the survey data doesn't hold up. There is really a strong effect on how pairing athletes and celebrities in general affects people's willingness to pay for and purchase intent and brand affinities. There is a real effect, but that doesn't always show up in surveys. What happens is people think they're really smart and they answer the survey and say, it doesn't matter to me. I care about the quality of the product. And when they use this kind of social desirability bias, this sort of sense of self that they want to self-report, they're missing the fact that subconsciously, emotionally, they are being affected by these pairings. So that's the first thing that we want to understand. The other element that was really key is that, in fact, when athletes were paired with a product that was a better fit, let's say Andre Agassi and a tennis racket, for example, a couple really interesting things happened. Number one, people remembered those products better than when that athlete was paired with a product that wasn't a fit. So there seems to be a strong indication that having a good fit between the athlete and the product is a good thing. Not only that, but when we looked at brain activity, there was a very significant difference in the activity of the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, the VMPFC for the neuroscientists that are listening, whereas when there was a strong pairing between the athlete and the product that they were endorsing and that fit seemed high, we saw more activation in that region. And when there wasn't as strong of a fit, we saw less activation in that region, and that region is often associated with placing value judgments on the product that you're looking at. And so there's a couple things happening here. One, the self-report data doesn't do a great job of predicting what people will and won't remember. In reality, people do remember the greater fit better, and brain activity, that neural response, can actually predict what people will and won't remember. And it seems to be that we're saying here, the fit is a good thing. Having athletes that have strong fit with the products they're endorsing is an important thing. So let's take this one step further, because that research, while interesting, and when we learn something from it, it doesn't look at a few really critical factors. First of all, it was all sans brands, right? There were no brands involved. It was just tennis racket, for the sake of example. And so what if we actually look at brands? Second of all, this was just static images, right? Here's an athlete, here's a product next to each other. There was no marketing content. They were not showing advertisements. And so it was just looking at it from in a very specific context, in a very specific vacuum. And so the question that we wanted to ask is, does this hold true when we're looking at brands that have a history of using athletes as endorsers? And we're going to go over a whole bunch of brands in this. Some of you'll see the brands that, that you work for in this presentation. And we're going to really look at this in the context of, like, what is the effect in terms of advertising? So let's go over this study that we did. And starting out, we begin by talking about the hypothesis. And so the hypothesis naturally is that we expected that if you have a stronger athlete product fit, let's say Serena Williams with a tennis racket versus something else like Serena Williams advertising for Bumble, that should hopefully produce higher engagement compared to when there's a lower fit. And that would be consistent with the results that we saw from the previous study that was conducted in 2008 in a more academic setting. So that's the hypothesis. But whenever we have a hypothesis, we have to be okay with the idea that science may actually demonstrate some nuance and some things that we may not be expecting. So let's get into the study design, and let's start by, well, how in the first place are we measuring engagement? Because the way that this experiment worked is it had multiple parts. One of those parts was people sat and they watched about 30 different ads. And it was in a very naturalistic context. So they would watch a bit of a television show. So they come in and they're watching Modern Family, and they're enjoying themselves watching a television show, cut to ad break, and then we see a bunch of ads of varying kind, including a lot of ads with athletes in them for a vast array of different products, and then cut back to the television show. And so creating that naturalistic environment is really important to the way the research was done. And meanwhile, we're recording various neurological and biometric responses, and we're also conducting some of the self-report things that, of course, people who in the neuro industry, we really enjoy bashing surveys and bashing focus groups and talking about all the biases. But the fact of the matter is that when you pair these things together, when you look at all of the data that you can glean from as many sources as possible, you get a much more complete picture of the entire story. And so that is the process that we use. So people came into the lab. They were connected to an EEG to read brain activity. All of the electricity from neurons firing in your brain processed live through the algorithms and the software that we've created. In addition to brain activity, although brain activity is by far the most important, we're also collecting galvanic skin response. For those that aren't familiar, GSR is reading electrodermal activity. Translation: when you have strong emotional engagement, your palms sweat a little bit, microsiemens of sweat that you probably don't even notice. It's happening on a subconscious level, but that sweat from higher emotional activation conducts electricity. So much like we're measuring electricity being emitted from your brain, we're also measuring electricity in what is the core component of a lie detector test, galvanic skin response. EEG still being more important and more powerful, but the combination of the two together gives us even more accurate and confident data. Simultaneously, we're looking at eye tracking, and the way that we look at eye tracking is different from what you've seen before, in all likelihood, unless you've worked with us. And eye tracking, the standard way to look at it, and certainly something we do, is, well, where are people looking, right? Are they looking at the brand when the brand is being featured? Are they seeing that logo? And that's one of the important things. But there's also different visual gaze patterns that help us understand the extent to which people are actually engaged with the content. And simultaneously, we're also collecting facial coding information. Facial coding, love-hate relationship with it. When people are sitting and watching ads, even small micro expressions are harder to pick up, because micro expressions, when people are just watching normal ads, come few and far between, but it's a great addition to the data. And so when you look at the data, we're able to say, people cracked a smile here at a pretty high rate across participants, or furrowed their eyebrow here. And so really, each of these sensors has their strengths and weaknesses. Brain activity is the most important and the strongest of all of the above. Combining everything, despite the strengths and weaknesses of each of these different elements, is what allows us to create algorithms that produce really strong, accurate results. So that is how we collected data. Part one of the study looked as follows. We first had to have an objective way of saying which athletes fit with which products. Now, we could just take a guess at this. We could say, well, LeBron James fits with things that are basketball oriented and not as much with things like cars, right? So we could take a guess at it, and we'd probably be spot on, but we want to do the research in as sound and constructive a way as possible. So we started out with a survey of 500 people, and we showed each brand for each athlete that we were studying, LeBron James, Serena Williams, Tom Brady, and we said, okay, here are all of the things. We include the shared sponsors, which is really interesting that all three of them are sponsored by both Beats and Intel. In some cases, the main sponsor, like LeBron James and Nike, the league played into effect, and then there's all these other sponsors. Each of these athletes, we looked at about 10 sponsors for, from Kia to Verizon, to Gatorade, to Bumble, to Beauty Rest, et cetera, et cetera. And so we first surveyed 500 people to understand objectively, how do people see which athletes fit most with which products, and what that fit actually looks like. So that's part one. We'll show you the data momentarily. But first, how does the fit actually look? The next thing we did was we measured engagement using all of the neurological and biometric signals that I went over just a few minutes ago for a host of commercials in that naturalistic setting that I described to you, where people are watching television and ad pods are coming up and they're seeing a whole host of different ads, and they're blinded really to like what we're really studying and what the goals of the study are, which is often very important in research. So that second part of the study, let's talk sample size very briefly. So we had 60 people. The first part, remember, was 500 people because it's a survey. And with survey data, you really need bigger numbers to get to quantitative statistical significance. With neuro data, we draw the line at 50. 50 is the minimum that we will do, because after doing so many studies, we know that anything less than 50 people in any particular group that we care about is not likely to produce a really strong statistically significant group. So we made sure to cross that hurdle so that we get good quality neuro data from EEG and GSR, et cetera, combined together in order to give us these engagement metrics like attention and emotion. Before they saw anything, we measured initial purchase intent across all of the brands. So you come in, hey, how likely are you to purchase this particular product? Then we showed the content, right? So they'd watch some content, and then they'd watch some ads, and then they watch some more content, they watch some ads. All the while, we're measuring their neurological response. And then again, purchase intent. Is there a difference pre and post? Did anything about the exposure to those ads change their purchase intent? And then finally, as is standard with our methodology, there's always a recall portion where we do various different memory tests, and a survey portion where we're able to understand more about the why, what's going on, how do we really explain more of the neuro data and what we can do with it. So that's the study. That's what we did. Now we get exciting. Now it's time to look into the results. So the first study, which was done remotely with 500 participants, let's just understand who fits with what. And so, as you might expect, LeBron James, he fit really well with Nike. He had really strong fit for NBA, really low fit for things like Kia or Verizon. When you look at Tom Brady, so that was LeBron James. When you look at Tom Brady, high fit for NFL, and then for a watch brand at the bottom of the list, right? And again, for Serena Williams, again, it's like similar, like things like Wilson. Tennis balls, tennis rackets compared to Lincoln, a car. I mean, what people perceive as how they fit with those products is exactly what you expect. No surprises there, but good to have a quantitative understanding of how much each athlete fits with all of the things that they're endorsing. So, how did these findings relate to engagement in the ad? How did these findings relate to purchase intent? Well, let's start with purchase intent. So we see something odd here. Remember, the hypothesis was the better the fit, the better the purchase intent, the better the engagement. Everything was going to be better for brands that had higher fit, right? Like something like Gatorade or Foot Locker or Powerade or NFL, where it really, really fits with the athlete. And things like Bumble or Beauty Rest or Ladder, right? Like these things should have had according to the hypothesis that we set, according to some of the previous research that we've seen, should have done worse for purchase intent. And we saw something completely backwards. Purchase intent was improved in cases where the fit was worse. So athletes endorsing something that they didn't quite fit with actually increased purchase intent, whereas athletes endorsing something that they fit perfectly with didn't increase purchase intent, and in some cases actually even brought it down. So this is a very puzzling finding. And so we need to dig in here because this violates everything about our predictions, the hypothesis. Like we were wrong. And I love when we're wrong, because when you're wrong on your hypothesis, that gives you something to learn, something new to look at. But we need to investigate because something is up here. So that's true for purchase intent, but there's flaws in purchase intent metrics. It is a self-report metric. It's not real world purchasing behavior. So let's see what happens when it comes to the actual neurological engagement. How does that work? And did we see a totally different trend that contradicts purchase intent, or do we actually see the same thing? And here are the highest and lowest for attention paid to the ad as measured through brain activity. And it turns out that we saw the same exact trend. So things like Kia, which was considered to be a very low fit, bottom of the list for LeBron James, that particular Kia ad was among the most engaging of them all. Whereas something like Gatorade, which should have been high fit, was one of the least engaging of them all. So for both purchase intent and neurological engagement, we're seeing that we violated our hypothesis. Worse fit is better. Better fit is worse. This seems to make no sense. So we have to dig in deeper. We need to understand why. We also need to look at it statistically and say, from a real statistician point of view, for those on the phone that are real statisticians, you want to know what is the Pearson correlation, what is the R squared value. For those that are not statisticians, when you're looking at this chart, here's what you can take away from it. Looking at LeBron James and all of the things that LeBron James is sponsoring, we see that trend hold true, right? Where the lower the fit, the higher the engagement, the higher the attention paid to the advertisement. And the R squared value of 0.87 is absolutely, just incredibly high. You don't see R squared values that high very often. What does R squared translate to? It translates to a very, very high correlation with this trend where higher fit of the product is actually lower for engagement. And so we see that statistically, these results are strong. Now that's just LeBron James. What if we look across all ads? Well, once again, although there are some outliers, and there ought to be outliers, right? Because the power of the creative itself is really the most important thing. But nonetheless, the trend held really strong. The higher the engagement, the lower the fit, people were more engaged. So, here we have all ways of looking at the data, whether we're looking at a purchase intent, whether we're looking at it in a bar graph, whether we're looking at real world correlational data, we're seeing the same story. And so our hypothesis was wrong. The commercials with lower athlete product fit had higher engagement and higher purchase intent. So what is going on here? Now we need to actually look at the ads specifically, look at the engagement patterns, watch what's neurologically happening. And one of the things that has come through in every research study we ever run, right? If I had to boil that, people ask me, you've run thousands and thousands of ads, movie trailers, movies, TV shows, and what have you learned about people's brains and how they attune to different things? And one of the things that just stands out, and for those of you in New York who have visited New York, this is going to be a familiar scene to you when you go anywhere near Times Square, like things that stand out, things that are unexpected, things that are surprising, catch your attention. And so that might be what explains this interesting and strange relationship. That might be what explains it. And let's start to dig into the science of why that is true. There's a whole body of research that talks about how things that surprise you really engage you, and things that seem off, a little off kilter, are some of the things that you pay attention to most, because something strange, it stands out to you. And part of the reason this happens has to do with different attention networks in your brain. And so you have a couple different attention networks in your brain. One is the dorsal attention network. We call it the DAN for short. So easy to remember, just think of a guy named Dan. And then there's in orange, the ventral attention network. And again, easy to remember, ventral attention network, think of a guy named Van. So you have the Dan and the Van, and what the Dan is responsible for is allowing you to really focus on and attend to the things that you are deliberately looking to attend to. And the ventral attention network takes over from the dorsal attention network. Van takes over from Dan when something is surprising, when something catches you off guard, when something distracts you. And that can be in very good ways and in bad. And we're evolutionarily adapted to doing this, because since the beginning of time, we've evolved that if something dangerous pops out, like you need to be able to reorient your attention and look at it and not get into tunnel vision. And so this is an important part of how your brain really operates. How did that tie back to the ads that we tested? Well, let's start with what was the premier example of all of this. So the number one of the LeBron James ads was this LeBron James with Kia ad. And although that was the lowest fit for LeBron James, it was the number one ad for both attention, which is what we measure through the neurological response, as well as emotional engagement, also measured through the neurological response in combination with brain activity, as well as the other biometrics that we talked about earlier. And when we did the memory test afterwards, it was also tied for #1 as the most remembered of all of the ads. So here we have some really interesting evidence that something that had incredibly low fit, the lowest of fit, actually was the best for neurological engagement, both attention and emotion, and it was therefore remembered most. And that makes sense. If people are paying attention, they're having strong emotions, they ought to remember it later. So what made engagement so high? I'm going to go ahead and play this ad for you, and depending on your internet connection, we'll see if it's too choppy or not, but I'll go ahead and explain it afterwards. But tune in, listen in, and let's take a look at what's happening in this particular ad.
There's a 1,000% chance that there's a 0% chance that LeBron drives a Kia.
At Nate Bordeaux 4, the probability of event B occurring, given that event A never occurs, is obviously 0. 0. Since this is my Kia K900, the probability of me driving it is 1 out of 1, or 100%.
So let me explain what we're looking at here. So the teal line here is the attention, and the red line is emotion. And these are really good metrics, right? There's some ups and downs, and that's normal. That's part of good storytelling. But overall, as we said, this was #1 for both attention and emotion overall, when you average attention and emotion across the time series of this entire ad. And so how does this tie in to the story that we're telling? Well, let's just listen in for what this ad is really doing. They're actually playing up the thing that we're talking about exactly most, which is they're playing up the fact that LeBron James, Kia don't seem to fit with each other, and they're using that as a strategy in the best of ways. So right from the beginning,
there's a 1,000% chance that there's a 0% chance that LeBron drives a Kia.
Right, so there's a 1,000% chance, there's a 0% chance that LeBron drives a Kia. So immediately they hit you with, we get it. Like there's no chance that LeBron James drives a Kia. This does not fit. And people immediately are engaged by that lack of coherence. And then as the commercial continues, they continue to play on that theme, right? And so now LeBron James starts getting up and doing complex math and statistics. He's not playing basketball. He's doing things that are totally unexpected.
Since this is my Kia K900, the probability of me driving it is 1 out of 1, or 100%.
Probability of him driving it at the end of the day, 1 out of 1 or 100%. And then we start to lose a little bit of engagement after that because the story really had its punchline and did a very good job. So this is an anecdote that helps us explain the data that we saw and how creating something unexpected does a really phenomenal job of engaging people to pay attention and say, wow, like, this is not what I expected, and therefore it's different, it's new, it's not the same old. And that is something that time and time again drives people's engagement. And so let's take a look at a different example where we see something that was counterintuitive but does a perfect job of explaining the main message behind all of this. So let's look at LeBron James and Sprite. So this is something that we expect the fit to be higher. LeBron James has been a sponsor of Sprite for 16 years. Nothing new, right? So not particularly surprising. On the attentional, the neurological engagement, this was the second lowest overall of the ads that we tested. And even in the survey responses, it was ranked, when people ordered all the ads that they saw about 30 ads, it was ranked as the least effective of the commercials. So this ad sort of objectively across these measures didn't do as well. And I'm not going to play the old ad. There's no reason to bash an ad. But what we're seeing here...
Let's get one thing straight. I never tell you to drink Sprite, even if I was in a commercial for Sprite.
Okay, so what they're doing there is like they're immediately playing into like, okay, I never tell you to drink Sprite, but for 16 years I've been telling you to drink Sprite. And it's actually, by the way, not a horrible commercial. It just needed some optimization. There are strategies that we learned from all of this. And when you look at these graphs and you see where does actually attention start to dip, there are things to do that can really, really fix this. And that's what's really amazing about looking at these results. You can really fine tune. And although this ad performed not so well according to the data that we collected, it is an ad that has the potential to perform really, really well. It has elements in it that are completely fixable. And this data can really help us understand how to do that. So what is the key finding that we've exhibited so far? And then we're going to go to Serena Williams because she has something else to teach us. So first of all, just remember, the unexpected catches attention every time, right? That's why we want advertising to take risks. A lot of times, one of the pet peeves of people who work on the creative side of the industry is the focus groups and the surveys sort of diminish the ability to take risks. And what we want to see is great emotional spikes where things are a little bit unexpected. And we want to try things that catch people off guard and surprise them. And so those surprising combinations between athletes and products can be used to your advantage no matter what brand you are. So you don't have to think, I'm a sports brand, I should use an athlete. In fact, as a non-sports brand, you might have the best opportunities to use an athlete. And so that's something that can be absolutely leveraged. So how can we best use athletes? What else did we learn? Well, let's take one more example from another ad, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions. I'm gonna leave 15 minutes at the end for questions. So start thinking in your mind of any questions you might have. And let's take a look at another thing that should have been really low fit. So remember, Serena Williams and Bumble ranked as, hey, this does not fit together. One of these things is not like the other. Now, this ad was highest for the peak in emotional intensity. So there's a moment in the ad where emotional intensity goes really, really high. And the way that memory works is you have these flashbulb memories, and if we can get one awesome moment in an ad, that is something that can really drive up the overall engagement and memory of the ad. It was also the second highest for the change in purchase intent. So the second people saw Serena Williams, Bumble, in the way that this ad was constructed, that completely changed people's perceptions of Bumble. I mean, it was a huge difference in purchase intent. And it was the third most, according to the survey, effective commercial. And so we're seeing from all angles that the commercial did so well, whether it's neurological response or purchase intent. And so what did they do in this commercial? And how does that compare to some of the strategies that were used in the LeBron James Kia commercial? But also, what else can we learn from it? So I'm going to play through the ad, but then once again, I'm going to kind of talk through a couple of the key moments and points in it on the off chance that you have a lower internet connection and it gets a little choppy when we play video.
The world tells you to wait, that waiting is polite. But if I waited to be invited in, I never would have stood out. So make the first move in work, in love, in life. And don't wait to be given power. Because here's what they won't tell you. We already have it.
Boom. So there's some really good peaks in here. I mean, for emotion to peak like at these multiple intervals and then get such a huge peak, and then a great peak at the end during the key branding moment. All really great things. Now, what are some of the actual elements of what happened in the ad? Well, first off, let's look at this really big peak. There's a lot going on throughout this bigger peak that established the product. And you have Serena Williams, she's not talking about playing tennis, she's talking about in love and in life, and there's a wedding photo, and she's interacting with the product, she's using Bumble BFF, and that's all during both an attentional high, so attention is really high throughout that period, among the highest of the whole ad, and there's this really strong peak of engagement from an emotional perspective. So that is working really well in that the product is integrated into her life, And it's a product that didn't otherwise seem to fit. And so it surprised people. It caught them off guard that Serena Williams is using Bumble. Where were the other peaks? Well, the other three main peaks that we saw, besides the big branding moment at the end, which is so important that that happens, is that were the times when she was, celebrating playing tennis, doing really like powerful moves in tennis. And so actually showing her skill, showing her with the sport to complement the story and create that connection is something else that you do want to leverage. So everything I'm saying about surprise people, have things happen that you don't expect, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't leverage athletes playing their sport. It is important to leverage that as well, and it really created a big difference. And if we look at that across all of the ads, when the sport was present in the ad, which is the teal bar, versus when the sport was absent in the ad, overall, having the sport present in the ad seems to pay off from both an attention and emotion response, again, measured through neurological and biometric activity. That's when we saw greater engagement. So what are the key findings? What is it that we need to do to boost engagement? Well, not only is there an opportunity when you create things that don't have a fit and you play up that and you surprise people, but interacting with the product. The athlete or the celebrity, as the case may be, actually interacting with the product is a really key component that not only ties the product into the story itself, but it creates some of those emotional highs that we really need to see in order for the product to be supported in the advertising. Showing the athlete playing the sport. Time and time again, we saw that despite everything I'm telling you about surprise people, still leverage what they are good at, still leverage the thing that they're known for. Don't forget that that is, can be a critical aspect of the story you're telling. And integrating the product within their lifestyle, the way that's done in that Serena Williams ad, is something that makes it personal, it makes it authentic, and it created really high engagement in those moments when her lifestyle was integrated with the ad. So overall takeaways. These unlikely pairings of products that don't quite fit with what you expect create these high levels of holistic engagement, and that pays off in purchase intent. Our brains actually are programmed, as we talked about with the dorsal attention network and the ventral attention network, to be able to be surprised. We crave that. We look for that. It makes you look up. It makes you pay attention. And so attending to the unexpected can be used as one of your critical strategies in fostering higher engagement. And that explains some of what we learned in this study, which actually contradicted our hypothesis in the first place. But once you look at it, it just makes sense. And that's what I love about great science. When you look at the results at first, you're like, this doesn't make sense. And you dig in, you're like, oh my God, it makes perfect sense. And so when you bring that together, also remember, have the athlete or the celebrity interact with the product, use what they're good at, what they're authentically known for, like playing the sport, and showcase how they really use it in their lifestyle in order to create that bond that makes it believable. And those are the overall takeaways. I am so glad that we had a chance to do this. We're going to leave some time for questions, and then we're going to wrap up. Certainly feel free to go and follow us in any of these sources. One thing that I always recommend, because we've got some fun videos up there, is check out our YouTube channel. There's some really fun videos about how emotion ties to decision making, about how storytelling ties to memory. So there's some little tidbits in there, little 2-minute videos that you can get a burst of some neuroscience education from. So thank you so much. I really appreciate everyone's time. And now there's a little question and answer area of the app, and some people are actually just chatting me personally, and that's fine. I see that Mehdi, you chatted me personally, and you can certainly do that, and I'll answer those questions as well. But there's also a Q&A section, specifically. So I'll try to keep an eye on both, considering I see people coming in from both angles. So the first question that I'm going to read through is from Irfan. Could you please clarify technically how emotional intensity and attention metrics are formed and from which sources? Absolutely. I love getting into the details of that. So I will do that momentarily. Let me read the rest of your question. Besides these two major metrics, do you take into consideration others like emotional valence, motivation, stress, etc.? If yes, can you describe how you interpret those in your evaluation? Phenomenal. Okay, so I'm going to give a bit of a brief version of that, because that in and of itself is a multi-hour conversation. But what we can do is we can look at the basics of how we interpret attention and what goes into the measurement of attention, and how we interpret emotion and what goes into the measurement of emotion. And then we can also talk about other things like valence, motivation, stress, and how we look at some of those other metrics. So emotional intensity is a combination of many different sources of data. It includes, and primarily the most important thing, is that it includes brain activity. We learn a lot about emotion from looking at the electrical patterns that are associated with feeling strong emotions. To your other question, we do also look at emotional valence, and I'll get to that in a minute. Whereas attention and emotion also takes into account, in this algorithm, what are we also learning from galvanic skin response? What are we also seeing from any facial expressions that may arise when they arise? And so we're looking at that combination of source, where I would say EEG is at the top of the list, and then you start to look at GSR, and then once in a while facial expressions become interesting. And so that helps us understand emotional intensity. There's a lot more detail to get into in terms of actually which sensors we're measuring and all of that. And we like to be very transparent about the science behind it. But that's the basics. Attention is really a brain activity only metric. Nothing about your pulse going up or your hands sweating or your facial expressions are really giving us significant information about attention, whereas your brain is giving us a lot of information about attention, and we have to look at it in very many different ways. And so academically, when you think of attention, think about things like focus, vigilance, alertness. Those are kind of like the academic terms to look for. And also looking at not just top-down attention, but bottom-up attention, and understanding the difference between, for example, visual attention and auditory attention. So that's probably as deep as I should get before we start losing people on the science of that, but it's something I really enjoy and would love to dig into even further. But there's so many questions that have come in that I want to continue on with some of the other questions, and I'm excited to continue that answer if we have time at the end. So in the LeBron ad, the attention, this is from Janet. Thank you. That LeBron ad. So attention peaked at the moment we realize it's LeBron in the ad. Could we not peak our attention and emotional interest, not what was being said? Also, if the ad tails off badly at the end, as we see the product itself in full view for the first time, is that not a bad sign? Janet, wonderful, wonderful, right. So anything that we say, I might say, okay, like LeBron said, there's a 0% chance that I'm going to drive a Kia. You could say like, well, attention peaked during that moment. It must be because of what he said. But it's not just that. It's never just that. It's never that simple. It's also the music. It's also the sound effects. It's also the fact that it's the first time we see a really famous athlete appear on the screen. All of those things can create that peak in attention. We have to look for, when does attention sustain? How is emotion going with that? But you're right, we need to look at those details and how those things work in combination with each other. And then it does, you're saying it trails off at the end. And isn't that a bad sign? Because it's the first time that the brand is really revealed. You're right about that. I mean, it's the, you know, we're not saying it's a perfect ad. And that is the value of using neuro, is you're not just getting an overall like survey response. You're seeing like moment by moment. Yeah, there was a moment it trailed off, and there's something that needs to be done to fix that, because the story ended and then everyone kind of like tuned out. and that's not always a great thing. There's so many questions. I'm going to do my best to answer as many of them as possible in the next 7 minutes. Let's see, Emily, did you measure whether the participants in your study were athletes or sports fans themselves? Because that can certainly affect engagement. And do people who resonate with the athletes differ from people who don't? So in this study, we actually didn't control for whether or not they were fans or not fans. In a previous study that we did for NBC, we actually did control for that, and we looked at fans versus not fans and how they engaged in advertising during sports games, and whether or not there was a boost in engagement when there was a pairing of sports-themed ads in sports games. And what was really interesting, it was one of those moments where you have a great hypothesis and sometimes you violate it. And the ultimate result of that was, first of all, there was just an overall boost of the context being shared of the sports game happening with a sports theme in the advertising. But that context dependency was something that was true for both fans and not fans. And so that was a surprising finding, but we attributed it to the idea that because they're watching something and they're being primed by a particular context, that context priming has an effect. Nonetheless, you do see some of the expected things. I have a great example of an ad with David Beckham, where it's really, you know, there's a bunch of other athletes in it. Most people recognize David Beckham. Most people don't recognize everybody else, and only the super fans were engaged when they saw all those other athletes. So both can be true. Let's see, we have another question here. In my opinion, how do we think the outcome of our study was impacted by the quality of the creative? Huge, huge, as opposed to the brand endorser fit. So when we look at it, we saw this amazing trend line, right? We saw that the fit was an impact, right? We said because there was a high R squared, right? Because there was a high correlation, that there was an attributional element where the fit actually was a part of that formula. But it is by no means the other part. The quality of the ad is always going to override everything else. So you could completely create an ad that goes against every rule, that goes against everything that you've ever been taught. And if it is beautiful, amazing, awesome, creative, and if you find other ways to surprise the viewer besides the fit being off, that's always going to win out. The creative is ultimately the most important things. And this type of research can tell us some of the tips and hints, and it can even tell us the details of what's working and what's not in the moment by moment, second by second. But certainly the creative is reigns supreme. I mean, that is absolutely an important thing to recognize. Did the research take into account environment or time of day? This research did not. Thank you for asking the question. That can have an effect. And we've done studies during live sports games because that can have an effect too if we're talking about sports games, for example. So it is important in certain times to look at external or ecological validity. How do we understand real world? But also we need to understand with any experiment, if we are controlling for one variable, controlling for that one variable allows us to do a deep analysis and get good accuracy. And if we let other variables into the mix, as real world as they may be, and as much as that's a really interesting question that we should do a whole study on, time of day, environment, like that's an important study, but if we mix that in with this study, we would probably have very few findings to really to report on. Now I'm gonna look, those are some of the Q&A. We only have a couple minutes left, but I also got some Q&A over on the other side in the personal chat as opposed to the Q&A section. So let me take a look at what's in there. What if the company being endorsed is a service company, for example, financial services, where the product is intangible and hence difficult to integrate or interact with? Well, I'm not going to say the brand in order to protect NDA, but we just did credit card. and they used an athlete. And they found a way to make it tangible, and they also found a way to make the athlete incongruous in a very delightful and surprising way with the financial service itself, and then connected it all together in a great story. So it is possible to do. Financial services is hard, right? We've tested, I don't know how many hundreds, but many financial services ads from retirement and banking and credit cards. We've tested across financial services. And on average, financial services ads tend to perform a little bit lower than some of the other ads that we test. That said, we've seen some amazing performance. And so that's really a wonderful, wonderful challenge to face when there is this intangible product that makes it harder to fit into a story, but it is doable. And we've seen great examples of that being done and worked with brands in order to make sure that that is done. All right, folks, I know there's more questions coming in, but we are out of time, and I want to make sure that I respect everyone's time. It's just about 1 o'clock Eastern now. I want everyone to be able to get on with their day. So thank you so much for tuning in. Thank you so much for listening. I hope that you found it fun. I see some comments coming in, and I really appreciate that. I do see a couple other questions coming in, and we'll take a look at those, and we'll reach out individually if there's any questions that I didn't answer yet. So thank you. And for those that are saying thank you in the chat, I do appreciate it. It's always hard to stare at kind of like a blank screen and wonder, I wish I had everybody hooked up to EEGs at the other end so I would know what your responses are. Wonderful. Thank you so much, and we'll call that a wrap.